There are moments when a public story shifts so quietly that many people miss it at first. Nothing dramatic happens, no alarms sound, no official statement is released. Instead, small details begin to feel out of place. A schedule changes. A familiar face stops appearing where it once did. A silence settles in, not loud enough to draw attention, but steady enough to raise questions. Over the past few weeks, that kind of silence has been building around a well-known figure in the world of culture and influence. From the outside, everything still looks intact. The images remain polished. The past achievements are still referenced. Yet behind that surface, conversations have changed tone. People who once spoke freely have become careful. Mentions that used to appear casually in media coverage now feel measured, almost cautious. What makes this moment unusual is not a single event, but a pattern, a series of small developments that on their own might seem harmless. Together, they suggest that something more complicated may be unfolding. Observers have noticed delays where there were none before. Partnerships that once seemed inevitable have stalled without explanation. Familiar allies appear less visible, while institutions known for discretion remain notably quiet. This is where uncertainty begins to grow, not because of confirmed wrongdoing and not because of any official action, but because the usual signals are missing. In high-profile worlds, silence often speaks louder than denial. When responses stop coming, people start filling in the gaps on their own. Online discussions have started to reflect that unease. Commentators are not making claims, but they are asking careful questions. Why has communication slowed? Why are certain doors no longer opening as easily as they once did? Why do people close to the situation seem to be repositioning themselves? None of this proves anything. There has been no public confirmation of disputes, no formal accusations, and no verified reports of legal trouble. Still, the atmosphere has shifted. What once felt stable now feels unsettled, as if a long-running narrative has reached a point where it can no longer move forward without addressing what has been quietly building beneath it. This is where the story begins to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as an unfolding discussion that continues to draw attention precisely because so little has been clearly explained. To understand why this situation has drawn so much attention, it helps to step back and look at how this figure's public image was built over time. The rise did not happen overnight. It was the result of years of careful positioning, strategic partnerships, and a clear understanding of how modern visibility works. From the beginning, the story presented to the public was one of progress, reinvention, and independence. Early on, the narrative centered around ambition and adaptability. This individual moved through different professional spaces with apparent ease, blending entertainment, public service, and personal branding into a single identity. Each phase appeared deliberate. Appearances were timed. Collaborations felt purposeful. The message was consistent. This was someone stepping into influence on their own terms. As the profile grew, so did expectations. With visibility came access to exclusive circles that operate on trust and reputation rather than public promotion. These environments function differently from mainstream celebrity culture. Relationships are often informal, but the standards are strict. Small missteps can close doors quietly, without explanation, and once closed, those doors rarely reopen. For a time, everything seemed to align. Media coverage was steady and mostly supportive. Public appearances reinforced the image of confidence and control. The individual became associated with high-level institutions and respected organizations, further strengthening the perception of credibility. To outside observers, the trajectory looked secure. Behind the scenes, however, maintaining that level of presence requires constant coordination. Stylists, advisors, managers, and consultants work together to ensure that every detail supports the larger narrative. This system depends heavily on trust. Items are loaned, favors are extended, and flexibility is offered based on the assumption that professional norms will be respected. According to public commentary, this is where the conversation begins to grow more complex. Some industry watchers have pointed out that the demands of sustaining such an image can quietly increase over time. As expectations rise, so do costs, both financial and personal. What starts as manageable pressure can turn into a constant need to perform, to maintain appearances, and to meet standards that are not always visible to the public. There has been no confirmation that financial strain played a role here, but speculation has surfaced in online discussions. Observers not. That high-profile lifestyles often appear effortless while requiring significant behind-the-scenes resources. When income sources fluctuate or partnerships change, the strain may not be immediately visible, but it can affect decision-making. During this period, subtle shifts began to appear. Media coverage became less predictable. Announcements that once followed a clear rhythm started arriving late or not at all. Projects that were hinted at never fully materialized. None of this was dramatic enough to trigger headlines, but it was noticeable to those who follow these patterns closely. At the same time, some familiar collaborators became less publicly associated. There were no falling outs reported, no public disagreements. The distance appeared quiet and professional. In industries built on discretion, this kind of distance often signals caution rather than conflict. Another factor often discussed is the role of perception. Public figures do not operate in isolation. Their reputation affects everyone connected to them. When uncertainty appears, even without evidence of wrongdoing, institutions may choose to pause rather than proceed. This is not punishment, it is risk management. This is where the background becomes essential to understanding the present moment. The situation did not arise from a single action or statement. It appears to be the result of accumulated pressures, shifting circumstances, and unspoken recalculations happening behind closed doors. No one has stepped forward to define the issue clearly, which is why so many interpretations now exist. What makes this stage particularly sensitive is that it sits between clarity and rumor. There is enough change to raise questions, but not enough information to provide answers. In that space, narratives form slowly, shaped by observation rather than fact. This is where the discussion moved from quiet curiosity into broader public interest, setting the stage for deeper questions about what may be happening and why the story refuses to settle. At this point, many people began to look more closely at what had previously gone unquestioned. The discussion shifted away from surface-level appearances and toward the systems that support high-profile lifestyles. Commentators were no longer focused on individual moments, but on patterns that seemed to repeat in subtle ways. One of the first questions raised in public commentary involved access. In elite industries, access is everything. Invitations, introductions, and opportunities are extended based on long-standing relationships and mutual confidence. When access changes, even slightly, it often reflects internal reassessments rather than public disputes. Observers noted that certain appearances and associations that once felt routine were no longer occurring. Again, no explanations were offered. Some analysts pointed out that this kind of pullback does not usually happen without reason. It does not mean wrongdoing has occurred. It often means that those involved are waiting for clarity, waiting for reassurance, waiting for issues to resolve quietly before moving forward. Another area of discussion centered on professional conduct norms. In high-end sectors, there are expectations that go beyond contracts. Items are shared, services are extended, and flexibility is granted based on an understanding of good faith. These arrangements rely on mutual respect. When that balance is disturbed, even unintentionally, it can create lasting hesitation. According to online observers, there were hints of friction in this area, not accusations, but stories shared carefully and without names, accounts of misunderstandings, of items returned late, of requests that pushed boundaries. None of these claims have been verified, and no formal complaints have been made public. Still, the consistency of the themes caught attention. As these conversations spread, another question emerged. Why was there no clear response? Public figures are often quick to address rumors when they threaten reputation. In this case, the response was limited. Statements focused on future plans rather than present concerns. The strategy appeared to be forward-looking, not corrective. This approach can be effective, but only when confidence remains intact. When silence continues alongside visible changes, it can invite further speculation. Some commentators suggested that advisors may have recommended a low-profile strategy, allowing attention to move elsewhere. Others questioned whether addressing the issue directly would require acknowledging matters best kept private. At the same time, institutions connected to the situation remained notably reserved. There were no endorsements reaffirmed, but no withdrawals announced either. This middle ground is common during periods of uncertainty. It allows organizations to protect themselves without escalating the situation. Another layer of discussion focused on internal dynamics, maintaining a public-facing brand involves many people working behind the scenes. Assistants, consultants, and intermediaries often manage logistics that never reach public awareness. When tension arises, it is often felt first at this level. Schedules change, instructions become more specific, oversight increases. Some online discussions suggested that this kind of internal tightening may have occurred. These claims remain unconfirmed, but they align with the broader sense that caution had replaced confidence. When processes that once flowed easily begin to require extra checks, it signals a shift in trust. Financial considerations were also mentioned carefully in commentary, not as allegations, but as context. High visibility carries high costs. When revenue streams depend on partnerships and appearances, any disruption can create pressure. This does not imply mismanagement. It simply highlights how fragile certain arrangements can be. As more people examined these elements together, the story gained momentum not because of what was known, but because of what was missing. The absence of clarity became the central issue. The longer questions went unanswered, the more space there was for interpretation. This is where the situation began to feel less like a passing phase and more like a developing issue. Not a crisis, but a crossroads, one where decisions made quietly could have lasting effects on reputation and access. What followed only added to that sense of unease, as additional patterns began to surface, and the conversation widened beyond industry watchers to the general public. This is where the situation began to change in a more noticeable way. What had once been confined to quiet industry conversations slowly moved into wider public awareness, not through headlines or breaking alerts, but through absence, fewer appearances, fewer confirmed plans, fewer familiar signals that usually reassure audiences that everything is proceeding as expected. People who follow these stories closely began to notice repetition in the disruptions, a delayed appearance here, a postponed collaboration there. On their own, these moments meant very little. Together, they suggested a pattern that was difficult to ignore. This was no longer about one cancelled event or one missing photo. It was about momentum that seemed to stall without explanation. Public commentary began to focus on how quickly perception can shift when consistency breaks. In high-profile environments, reputation is not maintained by statements alone. It is maintained by rhythm. When that rhythm falters, questions naturally follow, not accusations, but curiosity mixed with concern. Some observers pointed out that the tone of coverage had changed. Language became more cautious. Descriptions grew more neutral. Praise that once flowed easily was replaced by careful summaries of past achievements. This is often how narratives slow down before they are reassessed. Media outlets tend to wait rather than speculate openly, especially when relationships and access are involved. At the same time, there were signs that institutions were reviewing their positions. Again, nothing was confirmed, no announcements were made, but the lack of forward motion was itself meaningful. In sectors driven by image and association, hesitation can be as impactful as rejection. Online discussions began to map these developments side by side. Timelines were compared, public schedules were reviewed. Commentators stressed that these were observations, not conclusions. Still, the collective picture raised a simple question: why now? Some suggested that the situation reflected growing strain rather than a single incident. Sustaining a carefully crafted public identity over many years can be exhausting. Expectations increase, scrutiny intensifies, mistakes that once passed unnoticed carry greater weight. In this view, the current moment represented pressure reaching a point where adjustments became necessary. Others focused on trust, trust between individuals and institutions, trust between public figures and their partners, trust that informal arrangements will be honored without issue. When that trust weakens, even slightly, systems respond by tightening controls. Loans become approvals, favors become contracts, flexibility becomes policy. According to unverified commentary, there were signs of this tightening: more formal processes, more documentation, more intermediaries involved where there were once direct relationships. These shifts often happen quietly, but they change the experience of everyone involved. Another factor discussed was timing. The cultural landscape itself has shifted. Audiences are more skeptical, brands are more cautious, institutions are more sensitive to reputational risk. Actions that might have been overlooked in the past are now examined more carefully. This does not imply wrongdoing. It reflects a broader change in standards. As this context became part of the conversation, the tone grew more serious. What had once felt like gossip now felt like analysis. Commentators emphasized restraint, reminding audiences that no formal statements had been released and no verified claims had been made. Still, the sense that something unresolved was lingering became harder to dismiss. The tension increased when expected clarifications did not arrive. Silence can be strategic, but it can also be misread. Without guidance, observers fill in gaps using available information. That information may be incomplete, but it shapes perception all the same. There was also discussion about how public figures respond when narratives begin to drift. Some choose transparency, others choose distance. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong. The effectiveness depends on context. In this case, distance appeared to be the chosen path, at least publicly. Meanwhile, secondary figures connected to the story began adjusting their visibility. Some reduced their public association. Others shifted focus to unrelated projects. These moves were subtle and could have many explanations. Still, they contributed to the impression that recalibration was underway. At this stage, the story was no longer driven by speculation alone. It was driven by behavior, by what was happening and what was not happening, by decisions that suggested caution rather than confidence. Importantly, no official allegations had emerged, no legal actions were announced, no investigations were confirmed. This remained a discussion about patterns, not proof. Yet patterns matter, especially in environments where reputation is currency. As attention widened, the story took on a different quality. It was no longer about a single individual. It became a case study in how modern influence operates under pressure, how quickly narratives can shift when systems built on trust encounter uncertainty. This growing awareness set the stage for a new phase, one where public reaction, media framing, and institutional response would begin to interact more visibly. And it is in that interaction that the story continued to evolve, drawing more attention not because of what had been said, but because of what still had not been explained. As awareness spread, the response from the public and from established institutions began to take shape in quiet but meaningful ways. There were no dramatic statements or public confrontations. Instead, reactions appeared through choices, coverage decisions, invitations not extended, language adjusted to reflect caution rather than enthusiasm. Media outlets that had once treated updates as routine started approaching the story differently. Reports became shorter. Commentary focused more on past milestones than future plans. This shift did not suggest condemnation. It suggested restraint. Editors and producers often prefer to wait rather than amplify uncertainty, especially when facts remain unclear. Still, the change in tone was noticeable to longtime observers. Public reaction followed a similar path. Audiences were not reacting with outrage. There were no mass campaigns or organized criticism. What emerged instead was a slow, unsettled curiosity. Viewers asked why updates felt incomplete, why explanations seemed to circle around issues rather than address them directly. The absence of clarity invited careful discussion rather than emotional response. Online forums reflected this measured mood. Contributors frequently reminded each other that no allegations had been confirmed. Posts were framed as questions, not claims. People compared timelines and noted discrepancies, but they avoided definitive language. The focus remained on understanding how situations like this unfold rather than assigning blame. Institutions connected to the story appeared to adopt a similar posture. Partnerships that had been discussed publicly were neither confirmed nor cancelled. Organizations known for careful reputation management often respond to uncertainty by pausing. This approach allows them to reassess without escalating the situation. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, but internally it is often framed as due diligence. In professional circles, discretion became the defining feature. Individuals familiar with these environments noted that when questions arise, communication tends to move off the record. Conversations happen privately. Decisions are made without public explanation. This protects all parties involved, but it also means the public sees only the results, not the reasoning. Another noticeable change involved access to platforms. Appearances that once provided visibility became less frequent. Invitations to speak or participate were reported less often. Again, no reasons were given. In industries driven by association, such gaps can signal a temporary reassessment rather than a permanent decision. Still, the impact on public perception can be significant. Some commentators suggested that this stage represents a common tour. Ning point in high-profile narratives, when momentum slows, stories often enter a waiting phase. The outcome depends on what happens next. A clear explanation can restore confidence. Continued silence can deepen uncertainty. Importantly, there was no sign of coordinated opposition or institutional action. No lawsuits were announced. No investigations were confirmed. Any discussion of internal reviews remained speculative. Responsible coverage emphasized that these were interpretations, not facts. Yet even without formal developments, the situation carried weight. Public figures operate within ecosystems built on trust and predictability. When that predictability falters, even temporarily, the effects ripple outward. Advisors adjust strategy. Partners reconsider timing. Media recalibrates interest. The response also highlighted how modern audiences engage with uncertainty. Rather than rushing to conclusions, many viewers expressed discomfort with not knowing. They recognized that silence does not equal guilt, but they also understood that prolonged ambiguity can erode confidence. This balance created an unusual atmosphere. The story was present but restrained. It lingered without escalating. Each new absence or delay added a layer, but none provided resolution. The result was a sense of suspended motion. Some public relations experts noted that managing this phase can be more challenging than responding to clear criticism. Without a defined issue, it is difficult to address concerns directly. Any statement risks drawing attention to matters that remain undefined. Silence avoids that risk, but it carries its own costs. As weeks passed, the lack of closure became part of the story itself. Articles referenced the quiet. Commentators discussed the waiting. The narrative shifted from what might have happened to why nothing had been said. Institutions are often patient in these moments. They wait for clarity before committing. That patience can feel like distance to those affected, but it is a standard response to uncertainty. The same applies to media organizations that rely on credibility. They avoid speculation even as audiences ask for answers. Through all of this, the tone remained careful. No one stepped forward with claims. No documents surfaced publicly. The discussion stayed firmly in the realm of observation and analysis. This restraint helped prevent the story from becoming sensational, but it also ensured it did not fade. Instead, it settled into a steady presence, not dominating attention, but not disappearing either. A reminder that unresolved questions have a way of staying relevant. This is why the situation continued to draw interest, not because of scandal, but because of incompleteness. In a media landscape driven by constant updates, an unanswered question can be more compelling than a finished story. And as time passed, it became clear that this was not a momentary pause. It was a phase that demanded attention precisely because it resisted easy explanation. This is why the discussion has not faded, even as weeks have passed without a clear turning point. In many public stories, attention rises quickly and then moves on. In this case, interest has remained steady because the core questions are still unresolved. The lack of closure has kept the narrative open, inviting continued observation rather than reaction. One reason this story continues is that it touches on broader themes that extend beyond any one individual. It raises questions about how modern influence is built and maintained, about how reputations depend not only on public statements, but on private systems that most people never see. When those systems appear to strain, even subtly, the effects become visible in ways that are difficult to ignore. Another factor is timing. The cultural environment has changed. Audiences are more aware of branding strategies and image management than they were even a few years ago. People recognize the difference between performance and substance. They understand that visibility does not always equal stability. In that context, unexplained shifts invite scrutiny, not because of hostility, but because of heightened awareness. There is also the human element. Long-running public narratives create emotional investment. Viewers feel they have followed a journey. When that journey pauses without explanation, it creates discomfort. People want to understand what chapter comes next, even if the answer is ordinary or uneventful. Silence interrupts that expectation. According to public commentary, this is especially true when a figure has positioned themselves as transparent or values-driven. When openness is part of the brand, quiet moments can feel inconsistent, even if there are valid reasons for discretion. This does not imply wrongdoing. It highlights the challenge of balancing privacy with public expectation. The continued attention is also driven by uncertainty about future direction. Will there be a clarification, a reappearance, a shift in strategy? Each possibility carries different implications. Until one of those paths becomes visible, speculation fills the space, even when people try to be cautious. Institutions, for their part, seem content to wait. From their perspective, time often provides clarity. Issues resolve themselves, priorities change, new information emerges, patience reduces risk. But from the outside, patience can look like distance, which feeds further discussion. Media coverage reflects this tension. Stories reference the ongoing quiet without adding new claims. Analysis pieces focus on the mechanics of reputation rather than the specifics of the situation. This approach keeps the conversation alive without escalating it. Another reason the story persists is that it resists simple framing. There is no clear conflict, no visible opponent, no defined outcome. That ambiguity makes it harder to dismiss. It feels unfinished. In storytelling terms, it sits between acts, waiting for the next development. Some commentators have suggested that the resolution may be less dramatic than expected. It could involve a gradual return to visibility or a quiet redefinition of priorities. Others believe the pause signals a longer-term shift away from public life. Both interpretations remain speculative. What is clear is that the situation has become a reference point. It is cited in discussions about how quickly public standing can change without obvious cause, about how silence can shape narratives as powerfully as statements, about how trust operates behind the scenes. The story also endures because it highlights the limits of public knowledge. Audiences see outcomes, not processes. They observe effects without understanding causes. This gap between what is visible and what is known fuels ongoing interest. As long as that gap remains, the discussion will continue, not aggressively, but persistently. Each small development, or lack thereof, will be noted. Each decision will be interpreted within the existing context. This does not mean the story is heading toward a dramatic conclusion. It means it occupies a space where attention lingers, a space defined by waiting rather than action. And in that waiting, people reflect not only on the individual involved, but on the systems that shape modern public life. on how easily narratives can stall, on how silence can become its own message. This is why the story continues, not because it demands judgment, but because it invites understanding. And until something shifts, that invitation remains open. As this chapter settles into a quieter phase, it is worth stepping back and looking at what this moment represents, not as a verdict and not as a revelation, but as a reminder of how fragile public narratives can be. Influence, once built, does not disappear overnight. It changes shape, it pauses. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to define. Nothing that has unfolded so far confirms any single explanation. There have been no official findings, no verified accusations, and no clear statements that resolve the questions people have been asking. What exists instead is a space filled by observation, a record of what has slowed down, what has gone quiet, and what no longer follows the familiar pattern. In many ways, this is not unusual. Public lives often move in cycles. Periods of high visibility are followed by moments of retreat. The difference here is that the retreat arrived without context, without framing, without the signals audiences have learned to expect. That absence is what gave the story its weight. It is also important to remember that silence can mean many things. It can reflect caution. It can signal reassessment. It can simply indicate a desire for privacy. In environments where every word is scrutinized, choosing not to speak can feel safer than saying the wrong thing. That choice may frustrate observers, but it does not automatically imply hidden problems. At the same time, silence leaves room for interpretation. People naturally try to make sense of incomplete stories. They look for patterns, they compare notes. They draw cautious conclusions, even when they remind themselves that those conclusions may be wrong. This is not hostility, it is human curiosity. What this situation ultimately highlights is how much of modern public life depends on unseen agreements, trust between individuals, understanding between institutions, informal norms that are rarely discussed but deeply influential. When those norms are tested, the effects appear quietly, through hesitation rather than confrontation. For audiences, this moment invites patience. Not everything unfolds on a public timeline. Not every pause leads to a fall. Some stories resolve gently without a defining moment. Others fade as priorities shift. Both outcomes are possible here. For the individual at the center of the discussion, the path forward may involve clarification, reinvention, or time. Public attention is intense, but it is also fluid. Narratives that feel heavy now can soften later. Reputations can stabilize even after periods of uncertainty. What matters most at this stage is restraint, avoiding assumptions, recognizing the difference between analysis and accusation, understanding that not knowing is sometimes the most honest position. As observers, we are left with an incomplete picture, a story paused mid-sentence. Whether that sentence continues or ends quietly remains to be seen. Until then, the responsible approach is to watch carefully, listen closely, and resist the urge to fill silence with certainty. In the end, this moment may be remembered not for what happened, but for how it reminded us that public life is not a straight line. It bends, it slows, and sometimes it asks us to sit with uncertainty a little longer before the next chapter begins.